You want me to pray, or I guess I'll pray then. Okay. All right, we'll go ahead and have prayer, and then we'll. Father in heaven, thank you for the opportunity to learn some very important things here this afternoon. Please, we ask for your continued presence as we do so. And bless our speaker especially. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. So you going up? Or?
Okay. So this morning we talked about the Declaration of Independence and how important it was to the Adventist pioneers and to our church and to the country. And it was because of that document that eventually slavery was abolished, the Civil War was fought, and the country became, the Constitution became more harmonious. And we closed by noting that nobody pays any attention to those principles anymore, at least not as being important to the Constitution. We quoted A.T. Jones and Loughborough and John Quincy Adams, and I mean, we could go on and on with Abraham Lincoln quotes about the Constitution and the Declaration, being based on the same principles, this country being founded on those principles, but we no longer believe that. And I just wanted to talk about why that was. Now, we should note, beginning about the 1830s, some Americans begin to attack the principles of the Declaration of Independence. And this was right about the same time that the abolitionist movement was picking up steam. And again, our Adventist pioneers were a part of that movement. So as it's picking up steam, and they're, for example, flooding Congress with petitions to end slavery, at least where they could, in places like Washington, D.C., which was a federal territory, there was a group of Southern politicians that were pushing back, and among them James Henry Hammond and John C. Calhoun. John C. Calhoun said, it is a self-evident lie that all men are created equal. Okay, so there was the beginnings of this attack against these principles. And then there was a guy who was trying to save the Union from civil war, and his name was Stephen Douglas. And he came up with an idea called popular sovereignty. And slavery had been banned in the territories on the line north, it was the anything north of Missouri's southern boundary that was part of the Louisiana Purchase, there could be no slavery. Okay, but there's a tension between free states and slave states, and things are getting more and more tense. And so he wants to solve the problem by coming up with a bill, which did pass through Congress, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And long story short, that Kansas-Nebraska Act attempted to refound the country on new principles. It was popular sovereignty or squatter sovereignty. Whatever the people decide is right. So let the people of the territories decide whether they want to vote slavery up or vote slavery down. And perhaps the most famous debates in American history were the Lincoln-Douglas debates for Senate in 1858. Okay, they went throughout the state. They're still, you can buy them for your car to listen to. They're fabulous. to listen to Lincoln's argument. But I'll paraphrase them. Douglas said, I don't care whether the people vote slavery up or vote slavery down. This is a democracy. We'll let the people decide. And Lincoln said, the people can't make a right wrong or a wrong right. And he appealed to the principles of the Declaration of Independence, and he came out of, I mean, he was an obscure politician. There's more books written about Abraham Lincoln than any other person except Jesus now, okay? But he came out because he saw this threat, his threat to liberty and to democracy, to believe that the people could do anything they wanted to do in a democracy. That's majority tyranny. Okay, and he said, yeah, you might have the power to do that, but you never have the right to do that, you see. Okay, and so we know what happened, right? Everything looks good. The Union triumphs in the Civil War, and we got the Reconstruction Amendments, and we look like we're heading in the right direction. But one of the things about the Declaration of Independence is that if you read those, paid attention to those passages we read today, it advocates for a kind of limited government, because the end purpose of government is to secure rights. And during the Progressive era, people wanted a more powerful government. And the Declaration of Independence got in the way of that more powerful government. And they began to say, this is dangerous. We don't have to worry about rights anymore. That was in the past. We've moved past that. History has moved past that. And the basic idea of the progressives is that history is moving us in by the name, a progressive direction. It's getting better and better. And if we stay stuck in the past, those old Declaration of Independence, we can't keep up with the progress of history. And you hear this all the time. We want to be on the right side of history. You've never heard that? You never heard the idea that, well, my position evolves over time because I want to be on the right side of history. Okay, this eventually led to the idea that we shouldn't interpret the Constitution on the basis of the principles of the Declaration of Independence, like A.T. Jones and the Adventist pioneers and John Quincy Adams and Abraham Lincoln and the founders thought. We need to understand it as a living document. Let me give you a defense of this idea from a former justice on the Supreme Court, William Brennan. And he says, we are still striving toward that goal, and doubtless it will be an eternal quest. For if the interaction of this justice and the constitutional text over the years confirms any single proposition, it is that the demands of human dignity will never cease to evolve. Okay, so you have evolving standards of human dignity. And the first justice to move really in this direction and move the whole court in this direction was Justice Warren. And he noted that the basic concept, another quote, underlying the Eighth Amendment is nothing less than the dignity of man. The amendment must draw its meaning from evolving standards of decency that mark the progress of a maturing society. Okay. This sounds good, probably, but could you think of any problems with this? And I would, he says, the basic concept underlying the Eighth Amendment is nothing less than the dignity of man. The amendment must draw its meaning from the evolving standards of decency that mark the progress of a maturing society. Yeah, here's one of these questions that sometimes people have. You just have faith that all change is progress. Is all change progress? Okay. And by the way, I mean, when I was in graduate school, there were a whole ton of books we had to read to get out of progressives talking about the problem of separation of powers. It doesn't allow for government to be efficient enough. Nobody denied that it was good for protecting liberty to divide the branches into 3 branches. And in Federalist 47, it said the very definition of tyranny would be for the branches to get into one set of hands. All of a sudden, people began to get a new appreciation for the separation of powers in just the last decade or so, let's put it that way. People suddenly began to say, you know what? I might have been wrong about the separation of powers is a good thing. But the idea of this is that all change is progress because history necessarily moves in a progressive direction. And the Constitution just has to keep up with societal standards, whatever those societal standards might be. And in Warren's own lifetime, he witnessed the rise of Nazi Germany. And the Nazis considered themselves progressives. And they thought history was moving in their direction, the direction of the German Volk. Marxists, right, were explicitly historicists, believing that history was going in the direction for the proletariat, and the proletariat revolution was inevitable for history, and the kinds of terrible things in the name of progress that took place. So I would suggest that this is kind of a problematic interpretation, and yet it is the one that dominates at least law schools. And it used to dominate the Supreme Court, not anymore. There's only 3 justices that would subscribe to that today in the current court. But it is the position that most law school and legal academics will take, that we should interpret the Constitution as a living document. But around the 1980s, the Reagan administration began promoting a jurisprudence of original intent. And they relied on Attorney General Edward Meese. And the basic idea of original intent is we'll interpret the Constitution as the founders interpreted the Constitution. It sounds pretty good, again, because the founders interpreted the Constitution as based on the principles of the Declaration, but as it turns out, those that subscribe to original intent don't believe that's a good idea. Let me give the former Chief Justice, and almost everybody that is considered a conservative on the court would probably agree with this. This is not at all unique to William Rehnquist, the former Chief Justice. But he, in an influential essay, he criticized activist judges, and I'm quoting him now, who ignore totally the nature of political value judgments in a democratic society. If such a society adopts a constitution and incorporates in that constitution safeguards for liberty, these safeguards do indeed take on a generalized moral rightness or goodness. They assume a general social acceptance neither because of any intrinsic worth nor because of any unique origins in someone's idea of natural justice, but instead simply because they have been incorporated in a constitution by a people. Now, I don't know if you caught the significance of that. Maybe it should have been up on the screen here. But he's saying if you're talking about justice or rights, you have those. Why? Only because they're in the Constitution.
Constitutional sovereignty.
Yeah. And it's basically, it's Stephen Douglas argument all over again. Whatever the people decide should go in the Constitution, that makes the decision about whether that should be a right or not. So the Constitution creates our rights. And the only reason anybody has rights are because they are listed in the Constitution. Okay, that's basically an argument for might makes right. Whoever has the power gets to decide. And I'm looking at both of these two, the most prominent interpretations, and they're very different in some ways, but what do they have in common? There are no objective standards of justice. You can't find it, you can't ground justice in human nature the way you could with the Declaration of Independence. On the historicist side, you have justice, but it changes as history changes. And what is just at one period of history will be replaced by a new notion of justice at a different period of history. You see what? So justice and rights are relative to depending on the period of history you live in. Okay, that's moral relativism. And the positivist original intent side says there's no justice at all. The progressive at least have an idea that there is such a thing as rights. It just changes as history changes. The progressives say the only rights you have are rights that happen to be written down in the Constitution. If they weren't written down in the Constitution, you don't have it. Okay, and I want to note, and both of these lead to moral relativism and ultimately to nihilism. And we do have a problem with moral relativism and nihilism in the contemporary world we live in. And so much so that a new school of constitutional interpretation has emerged. Have any of you heard of the post-liberal movement? The post-liberal. Okay, it is a right-wing kind of conservative movement, mostly Catholics. And when we say post-liberal, it means basically we have to move beyond. Liberalism has failed. And when I talk about liberalism, I'm not talking about Democrats and Republicans. I'm talking about liberalism in the broad sense of political theory. So when I was talking about the Declaration of Independence, our rights come first. The end or purpose of government is to secure rights. Okay? That was classical liberalism. Just the simple idea, because before that, the idea was duties should come first. Okay, and this is actually kind of what this common good constitutionalism hopes to promote. But it uses certain language of natural law. It talks about natural law. It's attached to the Harvard law professor, Adrian Vermeule. He was an adult convert to Catholicism. And he's also associated with Patrick Dennin and Notre Dame. Okay, basically, common good constitutionalism believes that promoting the common good is a lot more important than individual liberties. And the theory posits that the Constitution should facilitate good government, prioritizing societal welfare over individual rights, right? We want the common good. And again, they especially hate those kind of Lockean idea of individual rights. They think that led to the nihilism that they're attacking. And by the way, they maybe get the disease right. They don't get what caused the disease right. because it wasn't Lockean principles, it was actually the abandonment of Lockean principles and this historicism and positivism that we talked about that led to this moral relativism and nihilism. But this is a movement that we as Adventists maybe want to keep a close eye on because it is associated again with J.D. Vance, another adult convert to Catholicism, is a self-described post-liberal. Okay, so it has allies in high places. And I don't want to get political and talk about which side is good or bad or anything, but we should at least mention that while we could think, okay, there aren't enough Catholics to in the United States to get behind this movement and make it powerful, but Harvard law professor, that's a pretty elite position. Positions of high power, and the fact that it does have a certain appeal to conservatives of all sorts, because it's talking about a very real problem, which is the problem of the sort of moral relativism and nihilism and the direction the country is going in. So I don't know, I've talked too long already, but I just want to say we have a mission as Adventists maybe to actually try to show people there is an alternative way to interpret. I wish our religious liberty people would get a hold of this idea and say, look, there are alternatives to the living Constitution, which is problematic, to the original intent as it's usually interpreted, with a few exceptions, and to this new common good constitutionalism. We can go back to what our pioneers talked about and promote the idea that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution rest on the same principles. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say. I don't know if there are any questions or anything else here. Yes?
Chad, just raise it up.
Oh, and by the way, before I forget, anybody interested in that document about the fundamental principles of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, 1890, that I talked about? It's right here. You can take a look at it later if you want.
So you didn't go into this too much, but one of the things that I kind of detect behind the scenes and perceive as the religious underpinnings and the Christianity that was simply accepted by default within the founding. And granted, obviously some of the founders being more deist, whatever, but just even still, just the effusion of Christian morality. And even Ellen White in Great Controversy talking about how the kind of like there will be a final rejection of America and its Protestantism, the rejection of American Protestantism. And so I believe that a lot of these values come from Protestant Christianity. So I guess the question is, to what extent can we acknowledge and advocate for the Protestant origin of the values while maintaining separation of church and state in the actual application of, freedom of conscience? Because I don't think it's possible to say that there are such things as secular values. Values are fundamentally going to have some moral component to them, and they have to have some justification, which fundamentally is metaphysical, religious, or some other kind of justification based on your worldview. And so, I guess, how do you get a firm foundation underneath you to even advocate for the Declaration of Independence? Is, I guess, kind of almost like where I'm coming from.
Yeah, well, it is certainly true that, let's say, Locke was a Protestant, and he's certainly important for the Declaration of Independence. But one of the things I was trying to get across today is that the Declaration of Independence provides a non-sectarian and non-religious argument for morality based on what? Human nature. Okay? Remember that and A.T. Jones, I mean, he talked about this, and the Christian nation decision came down in 1892. And they said, well, look at the Declaration, it's a Christian document. And the Declaration does mention God 4 times. Okay, it mentions God, nature and nature's God, which is, by the way, a God that would be known through simply the natural world. So it's certainly not even a Christian God. Then or not even a God based on revelation, I should say. And then it mentions the Creator, and it mentions the supreme judge of the world, and it mentions divine providence toward the end. But in none of these is there a sectarian, as A.T. Jones pointed out, his words were a Turk, an Arab, or a Hindu could all appreciate that God that is mentioned in the Declaration of Independence. There's nothing in there about a sectarian Christian God, okay, in the idea. And so where does morality come from? It comes from the fact that we share a common nature and we can distinguish between man and beast and man and God. Remember me talking about that this morning in the sermon? I can know that I can't rule somebody without their consent because we share a common humanity, and nobody's physical strength or mental abilities are so far superior to somebody else's that it will justify them ruling over somebody without their consent. So it's grounded in human nature. It is consistent with Christianity, at least with that part of Christianity that is talking about a human's obligation to other humans in the second table of the Decalogue, right? There are duties that go along with your rights for the founders, okay? You have a right to life. You have a duty not to take other people's lives, but even to preserve your own life. You have a right to liberty. You have an absolute, it's in the Declaration, you have a duty to resist tyranny in whatever guise it comes. There are moral obligations that come with rights, and they're grounded on nature, and nature is accessible to unassisted human reason. We can know why you shouldn't treat other people the way you treat dogs or cats. And I don't think you should be cruel to any animal. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. But animals can't give their consent, as we said. Animals don't have that capacity. And we also know what? And you don't have to prove, by the way, the existence of the God the founders assumed existed to know what a divine nature would be like, right? All you need to do is define what it means to be divine, right? We talked about this before. Perfection, perfect justice, right? Perfect mercy, all-powerful, all-knowing. Does any human being have those characteristics? And so all you need to do is reflect on human nature. The problem, why did we move away from those natural rights? This idea that morality could be grounded in nature? Well, Joey knows about Rousseau. I won't think Darwin. I won't go that far back, right? We don't have a nature anymore. Nature changes. It changed, okay? And so once you have that, you could no longer ground morality in nature, okay? But what I'm getting at is there is an objective ground for morality that doesn't require biblical revelation. It's consistent with biblical revelation. Let me make that very clear. But this was the whole point about the Declaration of Independence. It therefore allowed, what can reason also tell us? I didn't really go over in this idea of the pursuit of happiness. Okay, but common good, that common good constitutionalism, it's pointing us in this idea, nature used to be understood not just as what is something for, not just how does something work, but what is something for? What is its end or purpose? Not just to live, but to live well. That's where happiness comes in. We all desire happiness. That's what it would mean to live well. Okay, but we don't know for sure what will bring us happiness. We here in this church, I assume, believe that it will ultimately be what? Heaven, right? And we believe we have certain obligations to God. But reason can't tell us what that's a matter of what? Okay, and so the same reason that tells us how we should obey to other human beings tells us what? It tells us that our obligations to God go beyond what reason can tell, and so reason must allow for the separation of church and state and for religious liberty and for everybody to decide that very important question of conscience for themselves. Do you see have I lost everybody here? Are you following?
Well, you just have so many people out there already against that
Yeah, anyway, that was a very long answer.
You have cops out there every day, and they take an oath to uphold. They take an oath to uphold the Constitution, but they'll be out there and they will not do that.
Well, yeah, we have a fallen human nature, and that's always going to be a problem under any government, unfortunately. Yeah.
People up above us saying,
Yeah.
"Well, we wrote this law, so we have to obey by that law."
Yeah.
Well, you're speeding, so I got to pull you over to give you this ticket and take your money.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah.
I see that as constitutional.
Yeah, well, if what you describe is, and that probably isn't, yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I appreciate your clarity, and I have a lot more to learn about all these things, but it's very fascinating to me. I like classical liberalism, myself, but you've made this clear, but I mean, I just want to sort of highlight it. In my view, the genius of the Declaration of Independence, and to a certain extent, the same principles are espoused in the Constitution, but I think as Adventists, we tend to love, making sure that we get things right. So what is the truth? Like we have the truth, and like that distinguishes us from other believers, and these kinds of quests for purity of knowledge. And I think the genius of the founding in the Declaration of Independence and otherwise is to separate the quest for truth from its enforcement. And basically, for the first time in history, the United States government, if it's operating correctly, this is my view, you defang whatever the interpretation of right actually is. In other words, regardless of whether you get it right, like the progressives, the common good constitutionalists, the classical liberals, the overtly Marxists, I mean, whatever, it's not a matter of who's right. It's a matter of making sure that no group has the power of enforcement in the sense of I can force my views on you. Defanging the conversation, I think, is the genius of our founders, and is that represented in the Declaration of Independence?
Yeah, I do think it's important, though, that we don't know. Yeah, when it comes to, we have truths as Adventists that our only access to is faith. Okay, we can't. We believe in the Sabbath. Somebody else believes that it's been abrogated. Okay, that becomes a matter, and which one is right? Now we can argue from Scripture, but we can't argue from nature. But we can argue from nature that a person ought not to rule over another person without their consent. And that's a moral view that we must insist on. That is that's a kind of absolute moral. So there are, what I'm trying to get at here, there are objective standards for morality that we must accept and indeed fight for. And we know that, again, simply because we share a common nature, and we know it's wrong. We ought to know it's wrong to treat a human being as you would treat a dog. Right? Does that make sense? So this is an objective standard of morality that doesn't depend on biblical revelation, just on a reflection on it's consistent with biblical revelation. That's what biblical revelation also teaches. You get what I'm saying? But our ground for it can be simply reflecting on human nature and saying, since we share a common nature, I can see why I shouldn't treat somebody like a horse. Remember that quote from Jefferson? Some people aren't born booted with saddles on their back, and others booted and spurred, ready to ride them. Right?
I guess I would rather you say natural law than human nature, because my understanding of human nature is this deeply flawed and not a source for objective truth at all. So I think what you mean by human nature, though, is what I would mean by natural law.
Yeah, but natural law has to, nature is a term of distinction. That's why we're talking about the difference between animals and beasts and humans. Okay, and our access to it is, so the natural law actually, one of the things that its source is human nature. And yeah, human nature is very much flawed, but there's also an ontological dignity to us because we're created in God's image, right? See, I love my dog a lot, but if a house was burning down and I had to choose between saving my dog and saving a human being that maybe I didn't even like very much, what should I do? Yeah, because there's a certain ontological, and that's the kind of human nature I'm talking about here, this ontological dignity that we have as human beings. Yeah.
So I guess, I agree with you, but there's a lot of people who don't on philosophical grounds, in terms of saying there's no ontological distinction between a man and a beast. And so when it comes to those people's worldview who fundamentally are atheistic, who deny any kind of hierarchical distinction between creatures or any assignment of value beyond even what our economic output is. Like, how do you ground because there has to be some level of this is just what we take as axiomatic. This is, in order to get you to that place of agreement. And I'm saying we live in a society now where we can't even find that agreement. And so it's how do we make the case with people who don't even accept those basic axioms?
Yeah, you've raised the problem of our Constitution being interpreted as a relativist dogma. Right? We're all moral relativists. We tend to say, reason can't tell us anything about right and wrong, good and bad. You scratch somebody, and they have a different, because we all believe. That there is a right and wrong. And by the way, politics is always about morality. Okay, because it's. Think about any public policy issue you could think of, whether this war is just, or abortion, or school prayer, or health care, any public policy. What are you going to have to do if you believe in that policy? Aren't you going to have to say why it's a good policy and your opponent's policy is bad? Why you've got the right policy and they've got the wrong one? Why your policy is just and theirs is unjust? Good and bad, right and wrong, justice and injustice, that's morality, folks. And that's what politics is always about, because you have to defend it in a moral way. Unlike a gang of thieves who could just steal something and they don't need to defend it. Okay, but to your question, okay, when the founders said self-evident truth, we didn't really get into that. But self-evident truth does not mean obvious to everyone. Okay, it's a self-evident truth that all men are created equal. That's the ground of morality. We're all equal. No, we're not. You can say, well, yeah, I'm a king and I believe in the divine right of kings. Or I'm a slaveholder and so I don't believe in that. And the point is, the founders believed anybody with ordinary but uncorrupted reason, and your reason can be corrupted by false ideology. Right? The Nazis believed they were the master race. Right? Marxists believed the proletariat, the bourgeoisie weren't real humans. Right? Okay, but if you believe in a human nature, okay, an ordinary human nature, an ordinary human being should, the founders said, should be able to see the difference between a man and a dog. We should be able to, chimpanzees supposedly have a DNA that's very similar to ours. If a bunch of chimpanzees were sitting in church right now, would they be getting anything out of what we're talking about? Okay, because they don't have the same capacity for reason that we do. And so all you have to do, I would suggest, from the founders' perspective, it didn't matter to them that some people would deny the principles of the Declaration. You didn't have to have universal agreement. You just had to have common intelligence to understand the difference between a human and a dog. And that was enough, basically, and a human and God, if that makes sense.
I've been thinking about how to say this. Would you see any implications for, let's say, possible changes within our church in the interpretation of some of these principles for the use and interpretation of authority within the church?
Well, maybe you're, but I don't know where. I don't know, and I don't want to go anywhere. I mean, obviously, we all know we have to follow our conscience, okay? And that, but other than that, but I wouldn't go any farther than that. And that's, and I'm not quite sure, so I'm gonna leave that one alone.
So in essence, my question is, I think that a lot of people believe in social development or civic evolution, the notion that today, in the year 2026, there are a lot of elements of our society that are better than they were in the year 1226. You know, women can vote, women can own property. You know, we live in a pluralistic society where tolerance is key. You know, how do we come to a place where we recognize that we have a duty to stewardship of the planet, of our fellow citizens, and also recognize that we are also humans, fallen human beings who, you know, I think the difference is many view the history of this planet through an evolution lens, and they see the further back in history you go, a savage garden where might is right and it's survival of the fittest, versus the Garden of Eden where everything was perfect and created. So in essence, my question is this: living when we do, how do you seek to be a good steward and civically engaged citizen, while at the same time recognizing the authority of God and wanting to live rightly within the context of a Christian life.
Okay. Okay, there's a lot in the question, and let me begin with the progress part of it. Okay, so yeah, most people look around and they say, well, you know, there's a lot of things that are a lot better now than they used to be. But there are also things that are just as bad as they've ever been and maybe worse. Look at Ukraine. Look at the possibility of a nuclear exchange, perhaps being closer than ever before in history. You know, you can look to all parts. And remember, the progressives were optimistic at the beginning of the 20th century. Okay? And then what happened? The Holocaust, the gulags, the killing fields of Cambodia, the worst things we've ever seen in human history. So I would always be very cautious about looking around and saying, patting ourselves on the back and congratulating ourselves, because when we embrace moral relativism the way we do today, when we say reason can't tell us anything about right and wrong, good and bad, we open the path for, I mean, if all morality is relative, what argument do you have against Hitler? Right? Did he do anything illegal? Not in Germany at the time, because he was the law, basically. So there wasn't. And so what I'm getting at, as I think we need to still ground ourselves in two things. And this idea of a permanent human nature and in the Bible. And in both of those cases, truths that don't change. Right? Truths that that are eternal, and there are a guide. And so again, it sounds really simplistic, but you know, number one thing, I just ground myself in the Bible, and that would be my key. And you know, the Declaration of Independence helps. It was part of our for a good society, but ultimately, you know, the Bible and. But I'm not sure if I answered your question. Probably not.
Are you saying that society, that we humans, I can't hear you.
Are you saying then that humans, just because we're humans, we lack the ability to grasp absolute truths? In other words, earlier you had a quote from, I forget who was it, Madison or something, that's saying that we are to be citizens of a civil society as we are citizens of the Creator, something to that extent. I'm paraphrasing. Yes, yes. In other words, unless we have an absolute understanding of the Creator of the universe, we have no absolutes by which to bounce morality and judgments, applications of morality and so on. So it makes it very confusing because there's so many views of who God is. What is God? Who is God? What is his character like? Of course, we have Jesus Christ, who is the absolute revelation of God. We're very blessed in that respect. But so much of the world doesn't have that. And so many religions do not have that. And so if they're trying to extract morality, moral truths from a false conception of the absolute, we're going to have all kinds of confusion.
Because who's the ones that's going to call it moral?
Yeah, well, that, again, that's trying to, and this is really hard for us to understand today, precisely because we're so affected by things like the living Constitution and we're all moral relativists in a sense. We assume moral relativism. The founders didn't. And again, I'm getting, okay, the Bible and the Declaration of Independence share a common morality. Okay, and it believes that there is an objective standard of morality accessible to human reason by reflecting on nature and in particular human nature. Okay, and this is an objective standard of morality. What did Abraham Lincoln say in that first quote I put up? For all people and all times. We should always be able to understand that it is wrong for one person to rule another person without their consent. Okay, what we can't know as truth is what completes morality. That's where we know we should follow a moral path. Reason and revelation come together on that. But what completes morality, what is our obligation to God? What will bring everlasting flourishing and happiness in heaven? This is something that a reason can't take us that far. We can't know that, but we can know why we can't know that, and we can know, again, from unassisted human reason, according to the founders, and I believe them, I agree with them, we can know why it is wrong to enslave another person. We can know why it is wrong not to allow them to have religious liberty. Okay? Why we need to separate and disestablish religion. We can know that from unassisted human reason. Okay. We may be out of time here.
Well, I don't know if I fully followed Ruth's question there, but I just feel like reminding ourselves, all of us, that, I mean, it was, people, I mean, that is the whole problem. When people feel like their understanding of God is the understanding, I'm thinking about the church, established church and Roger Williams. Roger Williams was very willing to have an atheist serve as a governor, whereas the established church weren't willing to really put up with even Roger Williams' ideas, much less carrying them out. So I'm just kind of throwing that in the mix of your question, Ruth, because it's just not that.
I like math a lot, so I like absolute things. And I guess, I don't know if it's Ruth, your statement, the way you stated it, stimulated something in me. And so this is kind of my understanding. So how can we have or know whatever if we don't have an absolute understanding about something? And I think that getting to what Pastor is referring to is the problem with that. In my understanding, this is my phraseology, and you can agree or correct or add to, that we can have a true understanding of an absolute. And I would say God is that absolute, and especially us as Adventists and biblical. He is absolute. He's absolutely powerful. He's absolutely knowledgeable. He's absolute in time and eternity. But we can never have an absolute understanding of him, because the only one that does is the other person of the Trinity. But we can have a true understanding of him. So we can have an absolute understanding of truth, but then it's our understanding which then is God. And this is, I think, where we see the force of the radical Islam's, supposed Christianity, which is Catholicism. My understanding is absolute, therefore you must. And I like math. So in math terms, there's a thing where it's in approximation. And so with the pi is 1. And it's an infinite number that's always changing. But in using it in a calculation, if you just use 3.14, it's close enough to do most calculations. And it's a ratio between, in the circle, I can't remember, the diameter, whatever. It's easy to understand what it is. It's easy to estimate the value. but no one has an absolute understanding of the value of pi mathematically, because it's infinite and not like the number 3, it's always changing. And I think that's my understanding in approaching God in this way. Is I was going to ask the question, is like, how do we perhaps take these values? I think I need to study this a lot more myself, the Constitution and the Declaration, but I was thinking how I can make it internally, because there's so little we can control out there. And I think that's one of the problems. And for me, I'm not trying to control the government, the president. I think we can pray as Christians to try to influence that. But what I can do to a degree is control myself. And so I'm in looking at everything going on in the world, and the social degeneration and the back and forth in politics in the country and the social divisiveness, am I contributing to the solution, or am I contributing to the problem? What am I doing with myself? And I think that's because I know God's absolute and I'm not. I can give other people also the opportunity to take time to do good and evil to discover the same thing. And I can let the world, I need to do my part for myself and to help others to come to an understanding freely. But God, I think with us, praise the Lord for Scripture, where that absolute revealed himself to us in a non-absolute way, but a true way, that we could have an accurate and true understanding of his infiniteness, and to give other people the patience to, in their time, hopefully grow to a similar true understanding. And God's encouraging me in my life that there's a lot more growing that I need to do, and it's not so much about out there what's going on, it's what's in here. And I praise the Lord for all the craziness going on in the world, because I see God's hand working for all individuals to bring us to the point to reevaluate the principles of ourselves so that we might find what's truly valuable. And God's using these turmoils for give us the opportunity as individuals and as a society and a nation to reevaluate what's really true and what's really good. And I thank the Lord for that. Anyway, I'm sorry, I'm taking your spot now. But that was, do you understand my point about a true interpretation of an absolute versus an absolute understanding of truth?
Yeah. And I just wanted to say something about absolute. Math is probably about the only place, well, there's a few others, but one of the few places you can get absolute truth. But we can distinguish maybe between objective truth and absolute truth. To be, an absolutist is pretty dangerous. It's to be like a Pharisee, and there are complex moral. We live in a messy world where there are, to say absolutely you must never lie. Well, what if you are saving somebody from gangsters and they're in the basement of your house and they ask, do you know where they are? Well, in that particular circumstance, that absolute would become messy. Okay, and in fact, I think Jesus teaches that. And how do we keep the Sabbath? Does he tell us how many steps we can take? He gives us broad principles, doesn't he? Right? We have no bicycles. Yeah, when I was a kid, we had different rules, and then I went to somebody else's house and they had a rule that was different than mine. But we do have broad principles, and this is what the Declaration is giving, these principles. We know that acts of piety are okay. We know that acts of mercy are okay. Jesus healed on the Sabbath. And even acts of necessity. Jesus gleaned wheat. And does anybody remember the story that Jesus appealed to when he was challenged for doing that? David and the consecrated bread. Okay, you don't normally consecrated bread, but it appears that in some circumstances we're allowed to. Okay, so absolutes, yeah, that's a problem. But objective morality, understanding that a religion, whatever their gods teach them, a religion that teaches you to kill people and take their hearts out is evil. And you don't need to be a Christian to understand that. You need just ordinary but uncorrupted reason. But that's the point. Your reason can be corrupted by false religions, false ideologies, by lots of things. The founders, again, to get to this point, it was a belief that you could have not absolute standards, but objective standards of morality. right? They called for prudence. That's practical wisdom, applying morality in different circumstances. Yes?
Well, would another way of stating that be that as our poor little feeble minds are able to grasp what we can of the absolute, the practical application in our life, in our social interaction, would be the general principle: do unto others as they would have you, as you would have them do unto you.
That would be a good way of, I think if I understand you correctly, that would be a good thing, yeah. Question, Joey and Pastor Dan.
Sorry, I was fixing the camera there. So obviously you talked about post-liberalism. I think we can include like integralism and stuff in there. But one thing about sometimes Adventist religious liberty seminars and stuff is, we'll talk about the fact that, there's so many Catholics here, so many Catholics there, but, not all Catholics believe in integralism or post-liberalism, right? I think of the Princeton professor, Robbie George, who's very much been a promoter of, I think, along the lines of what you are. So maybe what would be a nuanced way that Adventists could engage with Catholics while warning about the dangers of integralism, but not necessarily labeling off all Catholics who actually do believe in the American founding and revolution?
Wonderful question, because I have a lot of close Catholic friends who believe in the American founding. Look, we really, as Adventists, got to get away from this, well, how many members on the Supreme Court are Catholic sort of thing, which I don't know how many times I've heard, when they have 180 degrees apart from each other on judicial interpretation. So yeah, it's not Catholicism that's the problem, but this new common good post-liberal doctrine, of which could be very attractive, given two things. Given the nihilism that we've been talking about, the moral relativism and nihilism, and this offers a natural law on steroids, okay? They think they can go a lot further than the founders did in the area of natural law, to the point where they wouldn't be opposed to establishing a church. Okay, so yeah, you just have to distinguish between, for example, different kinds of constitutional interpretation and try to persuade not just Adventists, but Catholics and everybody else of the wisdom of a particular kind of constitutional interpretation as opposed to another. To the wisdom of religious liberty for Catholics who are still a minority in this country, and have profited greatly from religious liberty in this country over the years. What I think is really important for us is not to look at every Catholic in politics and make the same kind of assumptions. Joe Biden is a Catholic, J.D. Vance is a Catholic. Need I say more?
I got this.
Pastor Dan.
Well, I'll just start out with this quick statement that, I mentioned Roger Williams was perfectly happy with an atheist or whoever governing. And the reason for that was because he saw government having nothing to do with the first 4 commandments, having nothing to do with our relationship with God. I don't know if, yeah. And I guess my question is, in the light of, the movements of today, what is it that causes these individuals, these influential and political individuals, to feel like that they can step over into, governing in the area of the first 4 commandments? In other words, governing in the area of people's relationship with God.
Well, I mean,
Is it just power hunger? Or?
yeah, well, I mean, I think that's how things always were done until the American founding. That's why it said this was a remarkable event where you disestablished religion for the first time, and it wasn't a matter of toleration. You had a fundamental right to practice religion as you saw fit. I mean, obviously you can't have human sacrifice, you can't violate other people's rights, but this was a revolution. And, we should step back and see that there is, and I hesitate to get into philosophy, but there's a philosopher by the name of Spinoza who labeled a problem the theological political problem. And it is a problem that goes all the way back to Socrates. Does anybody remember why Socrates was executed by the city of Athens? Yeah, corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods of his city. You see, reason and revelation can get into trouble with each other. And there's been a historical contest between the revealed word and where reason would lead you. And the Catholic Church used philosophy. Okay, and this is to answer Dan's. And this is what the Common Good does as well. They used philosophy, but they turned philosophy into what sometimes I think, the word for it, a handmaiden for revelation. Okay, so revelation dominated philosophy. And then you would get, these arguments for why it was rational to believe in those first four commandments, okay, which is where the problem came. Okay, but I want to say, so this battle between reason and revelation, whenever one side, either reason or revelation wins out, you get tyranny, okay? And you had the tyranny of the Middle Ages and the Inquisition. But those that tried to destroy religion in the name of reason, think about the Jacobins, think about the Marxists, think about the atheist ideologies of the 20th century that grabbed power, and some of them still have power today. You also got what? Horrific tyranny, gulags, Nazi Germany. They were Nietzschean, the guy who said God is dead, okay? So atheists, so whenever one side wins, and the great thing about the founding is neither side wins. The Declaration shares a common morality with the Bible and many other religions, not all, but it shares a common morality. But what completes that religion is your business. Your obligations to God in the first four commandments are your business. What's not your business is if you hurt other people, right? But as Thomas Jefferson said, I don't care if somebody believes in 20 gods or one God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. Okay? So the second table of the Decalogue, we can find agreement on. That first table, right? The remarkable achievement of the American founding was it left it up to us to decide whether we wanted to follow a life of dedication to God or a life of unassisted reason. That was our business. But what gets into it? Well, I suppose probably today, the moral relativism, looking at where society is going. Not all people, especially people with, and that would include myself because of my religious and also my convictions of the Declaration of Independence, like where we're heading, right? There is a tyranny of the left. I've hinted at tyrannies of the right. You can have tyrannies on both sides of the political spectrum, believe me, folks. Yes.
It's an addendum, I don't know if you read the chemical makeup of salt. The chemical makeup of salt.
Salt.
The chemical makeup of salt. I've never heard it explained like how you're doing here, reason, but that's what came to my mind. Because salt is sodium and chloride are both two extremely deadly poisons when concentrated individually in their own constituency, but put together they create salt, which we can't live without. But they have to be united in every molecule for that to function properly.
Yeah. So what I was trying to say is there has to be a tension between reason and revelation, and that makes health. It requires freedom, and it leads to a healthy society. Whenever one side, whether it's, again, the atheist side, get rid of God altogether, very dangerous. Or get rid of anybody that doesn't believe the same way that you believe in God. That's tyranny. Okay? Two types of tyranny. And again, the achievement of the American founding was to say we have to keep this tension between the two.
I have a question.
Yeah.
How do you feel that Thomas Hobbes' The Leviathan fits into this? I think we've touched quite a bit on John Locke, but isn't the kind of the other part of the picture the Leviathan? I think you made us read it in your class.
Okay. For those of you who don't know, another thinker, and I'll say there is some importance for us today. Thomas Hobbes is sometimes referred to as, remember I talked to you about liberal, right? Can anybody remember what I said the post-liberals were against? This idea that our rights come first, because that's what we believe in America, right? End or purpose of government is securing rights. Hobbes is the very first liberal because he said the end or purpose for government is to supply your right to life, okay? But he wanted an absolute monarchy, okay? So we don't tend to think of him as a liberal. He wanted an absolute monarchy. Okay, so what's my point here? And John Locke, again, our founding is primarily Lockean, not completely, but when we talked about these principles, they're primarily John Locke's principles. And John Locke, remember when I said you have a right to life and you have a duty to what? Yeah, to resist tyranny. When we talk about rights today, we talk about rights as we are absolutely self-owners of our body. We have absolute autonomy to do whatever we wish with our body. And we get some of that from Locke, who said we're self-owners, and from Madison, right? In fact, our property right, our conscience is our most fundamental part of our property right. But we're not absolute owners of it. We're more like we lease from God our bodies, if you will. Okay, and so a lot of times, you know, we look at a liberal like John Stuart Mill and we think that that's what the founders believed. No, they didn't. Okay, so Locke says you don't have a right to kill even yourself. Okay, and you don't have autonomy to do whatever you want. Now, why would he say that? Sounds like he doesn't understand liberty. My goodness. You don't have the autonomy to do whatever you want with your body, because he understood that if we could do whatever we wanted with our bodies, we could embrace the Hobbes option, right? We have a right to a right to liberty. We have a duty to resist tyranny. We have a duty to resist Hobbes. If you can do whatever you want with your body, right, is all slavery harsh, chattel slavery? You ever heard of Rome and circuses and bread? Right? How the republic disappeared. Caesar offers everybody a world of entertainment. Yeah? We can go to chariot races and gladiator fights and I'll feed you. All you have to do is what? renounce the republic. All we have to do is renounce our liberty to get stuff, okay? To get stuff, okay? So if we have absolute autonomy, and that's why this is a problem when we view rights as I can do whatever I want with my body. If you can do whatever you want with your body, as Locke pointed out, you could become a slave. And you could certainly embrace despotic government that promised you, I don't know, your own house, maybe video games you could play all day. You could take drugs and smoke pot and eat Cheetos. And all you'd have to do is what? Give up your liberty. Give up your liberty. You see, so Americans, I hate to say it, are becoming more and more Hobbesian, okay? Because we like the idea of comfortable self-preservation above liberty. The job of government is to solve all society's problems, not to secure rights. And part of their problem is, I want more stuff. Yeah. Okay?
Two questions. One is about how your concept of that you were discussing, the kind of the revelation being, you know, one source of information, and then reason, and how it's dangerous to have one kind of dominate or whatever. Kind of explain your view of ancient Israel's form of government and how that wasn't tyrannical. And then secondly, totally different, but what's your opinion on the two horns of the land beast, and if you think civil and religious liberty being the sources of the power of those two horns is a sufficient explanation, or if you have different ideas about those two horns?
Okay, first question on ancient Israel. Boy, this is a long. This would I wrote a book on John Quincy Adams, and in my fourth chapter, I go into a long description of this. But to put it simply, in ancient Israel, you had a God for everybody, but he had a chosen people. And therefore, God could legislate directly for that one people, okay? And since it was God's legislation, it was perfect, okay? But when you have Christianity, you have a universal God, and everybody can be a Christian. Now it is no longer possible for God to legislate for civilly for everybody, okay? And you now have a new circumstance that you've never had before in history, where you can be a good Christian and a bad citizen, or a good citizen and a bad Christian, okay? And before, I mean, we sometimes we look at that passage where Jesus says, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's." Would Jesus have made that argument if he was living in Moses' time? No. Okay, he was living in it was an occupation. Okay, so Christianity brought about changes, political changes. Okay, but to answer your question, what Israel had was perfectly just at the time, and maybe it was the most perfect. I mean, Deuteronomy 4:6, they were wise laws. Maybe it was more perfect. But after Christianity, there was no way for people to go back to that. Lots of people tried, the Puritans, and some people try to model themselves after Israel. But in the modern world, that leads to, as we've just said, to tyranny. So it wasn't until the American Republic that we figured out, okay. And again, I actually, I don't have time to go into, I write about this in my book, And I'm not asking you to get it. I know it's way too expensive, but because it's gone out of print and hard to find. But I do address this. This is when you don't have a legislative God, you don't have a God legislating, there's a great problem of political obligation, okay? And eventually what happens is, again, through John Locke and the founder, we figure out how to get that political obligation, as I just said, right? Revelation, reason share a common morality, laws of nature and nature's God in the Bible, a common morality. But how that morality is completed, how you choose to worship, what you choose to believe about what will be the, end happiness, human flourishing, that's got to be your business, because reason cannot tell you about. And I think this is your point. Right? We can't know that. Okay, nobody can know that. That's just beyond what's possible to know. But we can know some things, like how to treat other people. That we can know.
But the other question was
do I think that's adequate? Protestantism and republicanism, or
civil religious liberty.
yeah. I'm a political scientist, not a prophet. And I kind of hesitate. I have let me just put it this way. I have some thoughts, but I don't think they're worked out enough for me to want to share them. I will stay in my lane and leave that for the theologians and the pastors. I don't feel comfortable. It's honestly because I don't know enough on that to make that, to answer that question.
I think Chad could find your book, put up $200 or something. Read that. Well, we certainly thank you very much for coming today. I'm sure you'll stay by another hour and a half if people have private questions, but it's a beautiful day, and I thank Joey for recommending you to us.
Again, if you want to look at those later, you can.
Yeah. So, and I thank all of you for your presence, for your excellent questions and comments, and I guess we'll just close with prayer. Father in heaven, thank you for this important time, important information, sharing, questions, and we thank you for Dr. Gary. We pray for him as he is in a very important position there at Andrews University, and we just pray for ourselves that we might, that we all might have the true liberty that Jesus talked about when he said, the Son of Man, if the Son of Man sets you free, you'll be free indeed. And may we each have this experience, and may we be sharers of it. Is our prayer.